Thank you, that was amazing. You covered many issues there. I think we should give her another round of applause. So for those that don't know me, I'm Miriam Silver. I'm the State Director of CEDA in South Australia, State Chair of CEDA in South Australia, and sit on a number of boards and get to do lots of very interesting things. And so I'm very pleased to be here with you today. And you covered a number of issues, but a couple of things that stuck out to me were responsibility. You talked about responsibility to beat the odds and wise counsel. Can you maybe talk about a few people who have influenced you in your career to be able to feel that responsibility but also do something about it?
So I also mentioned the term survivor syndrome. As a matter of fact, I think it was Andrew, is it? The professor? Yeah. Who mentioned that this year is the 50th anniversary of the referendum on the Aboriginal questions, which led to Aboriginal people being counted in the census for the first time, and the removal of the discriminatory part of Section 51(26) that prevented the Commonwealth Parliament from legislating for anything in relation to Aborigines. So after that referendum came the reforms. So that was 50 years ago, and I can remember I was about 12, I was out the front here. One of my great aunts, who actually lived on one of the Thurabal reserves up past Ipswich, was, in a sit-in out the front here with placards, and she said to me, "Marcia, girl, you can read and write, so you have to help us." And, back then, because people of her generation, and she was older than my mother, she was of my grandfather's generation, even people of, my parents' generation, were actually not allowed to go to school past grade 4. And so we ended up with a population of semi-literate people, and those who could read and write had actually taught themselves to read and write. And people used to read to each other and help each other write things. So I can remember as a child, people would, read letters out loud, for instance, or help people to understand a problem. What always puzzled me was, how did they manage to put a bet on at the TAB so efficiently, though? They could always do that. So they could read the form guide, but I don't really know, because maybe the blokes were helping each other out in the TAB. But so, those of us who had got past grade 4, when, by that stage, all children were legally required to go to school, I think to the age of 14 at that time. And, there was discrimination in schools in Queensland, but not at the schools that I went to, except, for the usual racial abuse from teachers, but not actual racial discrimination, except for an occasional nasty person suspending me or something like that. And so, people like me ended up with that responsibility because we were literate. It was just a fact of life. And I didn't actually think about it much until, much, much later in life. So you inherit responsibilities because they're part of your social fabric. And being told, you have to help us because you can read and write, well, that's a direct order, isn't it? That was Auntie Teresa Smith. So if I know something about the world and I see that you don't know it, do I have a responsibility to tell you if my telling you will help you to stay out of danger?
Absolutely.
Yes, I do. That's right. So, we have these responsibilities. They're kind of innate, I think, to, being human, aren't they? So that's what I mean. I just mean something, you know, that we all experience, I think, in one way or another. I don't mean anything special by it.
Thank you. It was a really interesting answer. You talk about racial discrimination in the same way I say I'm a small Muslim woman that wears a scarf on my head, but people remember me because of my smile, not because I wear a scarf. And I really understand what that means, but perhaps the audience may not understand what racial discrimination means to you and how it affects you from your heart and creates kind of the values. You spoke a lot about values, and that must have been one of the things that helped you have those really strong values that you clearly have. I wonder if you're happy to talk about that a little.
Well, you know, I saw racism constantly in my childhood, but I didn't realise that until I was much older. I looked back on some things as an adult and said, wow, they really did do apartheid well in Queensland, you know. So, for instance, I was about 7 years old and I was in the Bollins shop. Bollins, a little town past Dirranbandi in Western Queensland. And the practice in the town was all the blacks had to stand at the back of the shop and wait for all whites to be served. And if they kept coming in, they were served, and you could wait all day to be served, you know. And also in the cinema, you know, it was one of those old-fashioned cinemas with half the roof off. The front half had no roof, the back half had a roof. So the back half with the roof and the banana lounges was where the white people sat, and all of us blacks had to sit down the front on wooden benches with no roof. So if it rained, we had to leave. But I guess there was a certain amount of resentment about it, because I can remember some boys catching a bag of snakes and sneaking out when the film had started and going up the back and releasing them into the cinema. And so they slithered under the banana lounges, and all the white people jumped up and down and screamed, and we all laughed. So, you know, that kind of racism was so normalised, it was so normative, it didn't even have the label of racism. It wasn't until I got to high school that I just started to get angrier and angrier each day about the constant racial abuse. It came from teachers and it came from students. There was the English teacher. I mean, you know, we were reading George Bernard Shaw, but, you know, for poetry class she read out some horrible McGonagall-style ditty about the blacks down in the water hole learnt to use the soap. Da-da, 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 da-da. And I got up and walked out. I was suspended. And then there was a girl who'd come from Darwin, where the discrimination was also pretty formalised but a bit different. And she announced very grandly on the school veranda within my earshot that, well, in Darwin they simply don't allow any blacks into the school. And it was only us white people. And I yelled down the veranda, well, it didn't do much good for you, did it? So I was suspended again. And also, and again, this, you know, it was many years after this that I realised how the racism had seeped so deeply into the way that things were done here that, you know, it was almost impossible to extricate yourself from it. So there was a Jewish boy, myself, and I don't know what the others were, but, you know, they weren't white and normal. There were about 6 of us, and during religious instruction, every Tuesday morning, all morning, you know, the major denominations would come. There'd be the Catholic priest, the Anglican reverend, the Lutheran, and so on. They'd come and give classes to everybody on religious instruction, and we were put downstairs under the school on a bench, and we had to sit there for 4 hours and not move. And the history teacher, Mr. Darbin, used to come past and say, good morning. We'd say, good morning. And finally came over to us and he said, what are you all doing sitting here? You sit here all the time. And we said, we don't know. So he went off to find out. And he came back and told us, oh, you don't fit into the religions upstairs. I've worked it out. We said, oh. And so then he invited us to join his debating club. I think he made up the debating club just for us. And so, you know, every now and again you'd come across a teacher like that who'd find a way to subvert the system, but very rare. I can actually remember his name, and I can't even remember the name of another teacher. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So before we open up to the floor for questions, so please keep thinking of your questions. The question I have, follow-up question I have today is, how far have we moved today? So where are we at in Australia in terms of racism and racial discrimination?
Well, I don't have to tell you that Section 18C and D of the Racial Discrimination Act are being debated. Might I say that all the contributors to the debate at this stage are white men, and they all want to be able to speak freely and speak their mind. Well, you can pretty much predict what they're going to say. Doesn't stop Pauline Hanson, does it? So I don't see what the problem is. Doesn't stop Andrew Bolt, he hasn't stopped. All of this bitterness about this, you know, the imagined limits on their freedom of speech when they're offensive every night of the week, aren't they? So there's that. How far have we come? The newspaper, you know, it's front page of the Australian yesterday. It'll be all over the news until Malcolm Turnbull caves into the troglodytes. So how far have we come? Well, we're having a debate about whether or not they, sort of, I mean, they're yelling and we're saying, really? If you can call that a debate, then, you know, there is a debate about 18C and D. So since my birthday on the 31st of October 1975, we've had the Racial Discrimination Act. It's worked very well, I think. And in fact, I just want to give you a bit more data. There have only been 20 cases taken to court under the Racial Discrimination Act involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander complainants in the entire life of that Act, that is, since 1975. Only 20. And yet there are, you know, 200 white men debating 18C and D and how they can't apparently say whatever they like. Bill Leak published his nasty cartoon. Others say whatever they like. I just don't understand it really, except, well, I do. They just want to become even more offensive than they already are. And actually, you know, the truth of the matter, I suspect, is that they don't understand that the main limit on their offensive behaviour or speech is defamation. You see, the defamation laws. And they know very well that people like you or me, or people from our community who don't have the money or the wherewithal to use defamation laws will therefore have no defences against the barrage of abuse that will just get worse as the limits are lifted. So is the RDA, are these provisions of the RDA a cheap anti-defamation measure, or, you know, a public good? Well, yes, they are. Yes, they are. That is exactly what they are. They're a bit like the Medicare of racism, you know. If you can't afford to go to a doctor, you know, you can find a doctor that will bulk bill. So I think that whole debate at the moment, I think, sums up the problem. There are people in the community who want the right to be utterly offensive towards their fellow citizens, and they actually want the right to be defamatory and know that they can get away with it.
Well said. So the CEDA staff have some handheld microphones. Please put your hand up if you have a question and introduce yourself before you ask the question. So what questions do we have from the floor? If you don't ask questions, I've got a lot of other questions. No? Question over there. Yes.
Marcia, thank you for a very interesting, entertaining, but also such a sobering recollection of really both the journey and the path that we've come on. With respect, can I ask you, let's say you've been invited by the present government to set forward an agenda that you'd like to see in the next 5 years. Can we ask you, I know we haven't given you any notice, so I beg your pardon for this. What would you like to see in the next 5 years that will make a difference in these terrible times?
Could you just introduce yourself?
Certainly, Judy Matthews, QT.
Thank you.
I've said publicly before that the Indigenous Affairs portfolio is, in a worse state than I've seen it for a very, very long time. Now, it's a bit like Social Security. If you keep cutting staff and expertise, and then, you have to save money and, you're handing out money, but you're trying to prevent, wastage and other inefficiencies, you automatically, in any system, end up at the kind of, robo-debt point, or something like the robo-debt point. That's what happens. And the system can't cope. We long ago reached that point. By my estimation, we reached this point certainly with the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, so-called, which took all of the grant funding, this was about 3 years ago, all of the grant funding available to community groups and lumped them into 3 areas and automated the application system with ridiculous deadlines, a ridiculous form. I mean, I was actually in Pomperau in Western Cape, York, with a little tiny group who were trying to fill in their form and meet the deadline. And, the system did collapse. It's been hidden from public view, but the system did collapse, and the bureaucrats couldn't cope with it. They invented it. Who did they think was going to implement it? So then they had to say, okay, we'll do a second round, and all the people who didn't get considered in the first round will be considered in the second round. And so very vulnerable groups were left without funding or any assurance of funding for a very long period of time. And then in the second round, many of them didn't get any funding. And so instead of a rational attrition of, what might have been considered fat in the system, you had these very brutal measures that caused immense harm. And so if you want to know why we're only reaching 1 out of 7 of our Close the Gap targets, it's because of that kind of bureaucratic inefficiency and, might I add, lack of policy. In the areas that I work in, there are a few policies. The one that is actually working is the Indigenous procurement policy and the VTEC, Vocational Training and Education Centres policy, the Employment Parity Initiative, which has corporate partners employing Indigenous people. But there are so many areas that simply have no policy whatsoever, or nothing that looks like a real policy. Instead, what we have are these funding regimes that are failing us very badly. And so, you will have seen Sarah Hudson's report from the Centre for Independent Studies, in which she found that a tiny proportion of all of that money, $4 billion supposed to be handed out under the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, less than 4% of $4 billion was evaluated. How can that be? So we have no idea of what works and what doesn't work. So there's no policy. You must have good measurement tools and you must have good reporting tools. We have neither in Indigenous Affairs. So what do we want? Rigorous measurement and good reporting and evaluation and policies. And we definitely need two things. The involvement of Aboriginal people in the policy development, but we also need the involvement of experts. So yesterday, Professor Glover gave an important headline speech for Universities Australia on the decline in the respect for and involvement of and regard for experts, and the increasing scepticism, unwarranted scepticism, manufactured alt-right scepticism of experts. We need experts along with the community in developing Indigenous affairs policies and systems. So in the Indigenous sector, the community sector is very big. The community Aboriginal controlled NGO sector is a very large part of the Indigenous sector. That sector is the delivery arm of services. And governments say that they have closed the gap strategies, but they exclude the very people who are delivering the services, and increasingly they are excluding experts. And so, you know, if you had an Indigenous Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, and yes, there's, you know, one expert, but, you know, she's a GP. Wouldn't you want some experts on your Advisory Council? Maybe an evaluation expert, maybe a policy expert. And if you're not meeting your child mortality targets, wouldn't you want an epidemiological paediatrician on your Advisory Council? So there's a very long list, and I've given you a snapshot, and I won't go on any more about it.
Thank you. You're certainly right, though, in terms of the policy, having the data to inform the policy and including the right people in developing the policy. The second question's over there.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you, Marcia. My name is Danielle. I'm from CGU Insurance. I've got a question about the gender gap. You talk about affirmative action for females in the workforce, and there's an argument about taking affirmative action for males and trying to act as a facilitator or catalyst to place them in traditionally female gender roles in society or work. Do you think it's something we should consider, or do you think there's something we can do, whether it be policy-wise or in the workforce, to help make that happen?
Oh yeah, look, the answer to that question is definitely yes. See, maybe I didn't explain it clearly enough in my presentation, but for Indigenous university enrolled students and Indigenous graduates, women are in the majority. Indigenous women are in the majority. And it's the Indigenous men who are the disadvantaged group. So the gender gap in our community is kind of reversed. It looks the opposite of the gender gap for all Australians as per the workforce gender equity data. So yes, we have to include men, but if your target is to say, instead of, what did I say, 1 in 6 CEOs is female, if your target is 3 out of 6, how are you going to get there if you don't persuade men in various ways? Why would a woman be appointed? Everybody say, well, it's got to be a meritocracy. Well, is 50% of the population, does 50% of the population consist of idiots? I mean, that's the only retort to that, you know, meritocracy argument, isn't it? So, yeah, we have to take men with us. So you've got male champions of change in the corporate world. And I think actually we Indigenous women have to, you know, become champions for Indigenous men in universities, actually, you know, in getting an education.
I love that. Yeah, that's great. I have the last question. So as you mentioned, next week is International Women's Day and the theme is Be Bold for Change. So what's your comment? What is it that you will be bold for change for?
Well, for some time in my spare time, I've been tackling the problems of, well, I'll call it, this is the term I'm thinking about today, preparing for a speech I'm giving on Sunday, problem deflation. Problem deflation is a concept invented by Professor Robin Room, who's a global expert on the harmful impact of alcohol on a population-wide basis. He was at my university for a while. I was very much influenced by him. And what we have in relation to violence against women, especially in the Indigenous community, is problem deflation. The levels of violence are so alarming, and yet, you know, the policy responses and the service responses are so inadequate. It's such a clear case of problem deflation. And so, for instance, you hear people saying things, and this is even in the third National Action Plan on violence against women and children. For Indigenous people, violence is cultural. No, it's not. It is not. This is a nonsense. So people have misread, misunderstood the anthropological literature. And I think Peter Sutton's book isn't particularly complex enough on this problem. So yes, Aboriginal society did have its forms of violence, and yes, every human society has violence, but I mean, you know, there's really only, I don't want to go into all of that, that's for another time, but there's really only one thing to say. Assault is a crime. Rape is a crime. We ought to be thinking about making financial abuse a crime as well. But anyway, so therefore, if we value the rule of law, then people who commit crimes should be subject to the rule of law. And nonsense about it's cultural is not an excuse for not applying the law. So there's an Icelandic woman who's speaking on Sunday in Sydney, and unfortunately I'm going to be trapped at a dinner listening to her dinner speech, and she's forgiven her rapist. He's Australian and he's never been charged. And both of them speak publicly, it's broadcast. There's a clear case, according to my lawyer friends, against him. He should have been charged. It's not for her as the victim to decide whether or not the rule of law applies to him. So I think that is going to be my contribution to International Women's Day, is just with some of my friends thinking through that problem.
We've run out of time for more questions, and before Carl comes up to close, I'd certainly like to, I'm sure we could listen to you, Marcia, for hours. I'm sure all the audience have just been fascinated. No one's even left. And I'm sure there are a lot more questions out there. But certainly from my perspective, it's very easy to see why Marcia's managed to achieve so much, just such a force for good and such strong values, and the determination and the resilience that she has just comes across. She didn't need to say it, it comes across in who she is as a person. So as Carl comes up to close, please join me again in thanking Professor Langton.